As the United States was suffering through the Great Depression in the 1930s, we can see that Europe was suffering as well. The Great Depression was by no means an American phenomenon. In fact, it hit Europe much harder, much earlier than in the United States. There is some evidence that the New Deal did mitigate the suffering in the United States, whereas in Europe there was a whole mess of issues. And a lot of the things that we did to mitigate that problem here in the United States actually made the problem worse in Europe. So domestically, we're very concerned about us. And in fact, as the Great Depression went on, we became much more isolationist, meaning we didn't want to interact with other countries. So as the 1930s go on, we actually ignored a whole lot of problems happening in Europe. Part of this is that Monroe Doctrine. We didn't want to get involved in European affairs. We did in World War I, and then we immediately moved back into isolationism. So we ignored the rise of dictators abroad. We did try to work with them in some cases. For example, in Germany, we were accepting Hitler early on as long as he promised to pay back those loans and to pay off the reparations that Germany was forced to pay. That falls apart midway through the 1930s. But in Italy, we have the rise of Mussolini. In Germany, we have the rise of Hitler. Now, they have a couple of things in common. They're both totalitarian and they're both fascist. Totalitarianism, and this is important, means that the needs of the state come before the needs of the individual. So this whole idea of free press, freedom of religion, all that kind of stuff, that is non-existent in a totalitarian state. It's whatever the leader says. That's what goes. And you're expected to put your needs aside for the needs of the government or the state. They're also fascist, which means they're ultra-militaristic. They want to build and build and build the military. They're ultra-nationalistic, meaning that they want to get rid of anything that is impure to their nation. And a nation is a shared common language, heritage, culture. So in Germany, it's all Germany, and if anything that's not German has to be removed. And this is where we get the beginnings of the Holocaust, the removal of the Jewish population. And they're also totalitarian. And what fascists fear and hate more than anything is communists. They do support capitalism. They want to eliminate communists, which is interesting later, and we'll get to that. There's also the rise of the Emperor Tojo in Japan. Again, a totalitarian emperor, not fascist in the sense, but they do modernize the Japanese military, which causes some tensions and issues in the 1930s, which eventually leads to the surprise attack in Pearl Harbor. During the 1930s, the United States became more and more isolationist. Remember, after World War I, the United States was very disillusioned by what it called the Great War. Saw a lot of the progress of the 1910s as an illusion, and it really wanted to go back to working on its own country. We entered into the Roaring '20s and really just wanted to focus on being in the United States. If you remember, this makes sense because it goes back to the Monroe Doctrine, this idea that Europe should stay in Europe and the United States will take care of the Western Hemisphere, and we won't interact with each other. Now, because of this, the United States was unwilling to assist when all those dictators rose up in Europe, and they wanted to ensure by law that the United States wouldn't be dragged into any of these wars. So how did we do this? Well, in the 1930s, Congress passed a series of laws known as the Neutrality Acts. And they looked at the causes of World War I, and they wanted to prevent the situations that led to our involvement in World War I. So first of all, one of the causes of World War I was the unrestricted submarine warfare and the fact that it killed Americans on the ocean. So they passed a law that said that no Americans were allowed to be passengers on ships or vessels that were from a nation that was at war. They also looked at the war profiteering, all of the loans that were given out to the Allied forces, all of this, the trade that was done with the Allied forces. And they passed a law that said there would be no sale of arms, weapons, and no loans given out to any nation that was at war, any nation considering military action. So they're trying to prevent the situation that led to World War I. Now, this makes a whole lot of sense, but it does limit Franklin Roosevelt's responses when, say, Hitler starts passing laws that take away the democracy of Germany, or when Japan becomes aggressive in the Pacific. One other thing to note, that the 1920s also saw a series of immigration restrictions, severely cutting down who could come into the country. This also limits Franklin Roosevelt's response when it becomes obvious that the Jews are being discriminated against in Germany, and they try to immigrate to the United States. Remember that presidents are limited by Congress. They have to follow the law. They have to follow the Constitution. They do have limited powers even in these situations. As the Great Depression went on, the Japanese became much, much more aggressive. And in 1942, the Japanese do attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. But the roots of that attack actually fall back way into the 1930s. In fact, in the 1920s, the Japanese began a process of modernizing their country. They wanted to industrialize and become a world power. As part of this, they become very militaristic. They updated their Army and Navy to become more of a Western-style Army and Navy. They wanted to be a world power, but they lacked a lot of the natural resources necessary for that. Not only militaristically do they want to be a world power, but economically they want to industrialize, and they want to be an industrial economic power as well. In order to gather the resources that they needed, like coal and iron and oil, they began to take over other Pacific nations. In 1931, the Japanese began a program of economic and territorial imperialism by taking over Manchuria, which is next to China. So they invaded Manchuria, and that began a policy in which they take over small chunks of China and other territories in Indochina. Essentially, what Japan does is create a Pacific empire. Now, Roosevelt later, the United States initially, and Roosevelt later, is going to be hampered by both the public's desire for isolationism, not wanting to get involved in this war, and those neutrality acts were passed on early in the 1930s. Really, the only thing that Roosevelt and the United States can do is enact trade restrictions, and this is very effective. They embargo gasoline, iron, oil, and a few other things from the United States being sent to the Japanese. Embargo means they're not allowed to trade that. So it's pretty effective, and the Japanese felt very threatened. In fact, when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor happens, there are actually ambassadors in Washington, D.C. trying to negotiate the end of these embargoes. So the roots of Japanese aggression of the 1930s actually helped lead to World War II U.S. involvement. At least get the reparations back that it was owed to us. There was some evidence of his aggressiveness early on. He did form a pact with the Soviet Union, which was surprising because the Soviet Union is communist and fascists hate communists. That's going to fall apart in the early 1940s, late 1930s. He allies himself with the other fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini, in Italy. Later, they're going to also unite up with Japanese Emperor Tojo. We're going to call them the Axis powers. The British tried to appease Adolf Hitler. In the late 1930s, Hitler did remove himself from the Versailles Treaty. This had overwhelmingly popular opinion in Germany. He then used the military that he had both illegally and then after leaving the Versailles Treaty legally built up. He took over the Rhineland, which was formerly been part of Germany. He also took over parts of Austria and little chunks of France. Britain was in no place to try to fight against Germany that was still suffering through the Great Depression. Nobody really wanted to fight, so they tried a policy known as appeasement. They tried to give Hitler what he wanted, and in return, Hitler would promise not to attack any more countries. So they gave Hitler a little chunk of Czechoslovakia and got the promise from Hitler that he wouldn't do it anymore. Hitler immediately went back on this, and the policy of appeasement just totally failed. Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, essentially breaking that Munich Pact. France and Britain then both immediately declared war on Germany. Unfortunately, they were not ready for the style of warfare that Germany was fighting. It's known as the Blitzkrieg, or lightning warfare. Unlike World War I, which had been fought in the trenches, Germany had a new philosophy of attacking fast with overwhelming superior force. Not getting bogged down by attacking the trenches, but going around the trenches and trying to quickly attack. France fell within weeks. Now, this terrified the United States. Only Britain was now a defense against the aggressive Germans. Britain itself was being attacked in the Battle of Britain, which was a months-long bombing campaign by the Germans trying to soften it up. It attacked the industrial cities of the South England, hopefully with the hopes that they would be able to invade England later. All of this added together causes the United States to be much more concerned and start contemplating how it can start to defend itself and maybe even participate in the war if necessary. As World War II progressed in Europe, the United States became more and more concerned with their own protection. We wanted to aid the Allies because we were afraid that what we had traditionally called Fortress America was threatened. We had always had the ocean to the left of us and to the right of us, but now there's only one major world power left to fight against the Nazis instead of us. The fear was that since France had fallen within 6 weeks, and now Britain was being demolished by the Battle of Britain, these nightly attacks on their industrial cities. The fear was that they wouldn't be able to defend themselves. They would fall to the Nazis. The Nazis would then gain the British Navy, and then would be able to attack us even more easily. Fortress America was threatened, so a committee formed, a committee called the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. There was an effort to try to use the American economic power and industrial power to give supplies and weapons to the British and the other allies so that we wouldn't have to do the fighting. So Roosevelt, though, was hamstrung a little bit in this, in that the Neutrality Acts were still in place. So they'd begin the process of trying to amend or get rid of some of those Neutrality Acts. So it's a sort of a progressive move towards involvement in the war. In fact, you'll hear it called isolation to interventionism. It begins with a program called Cash and Carry. One of the Neutrality Act's policies was that we couldn't loan money to the other nations, and we couldn't put our sailors at risk by going into unrestricted submarine territory. So in Cash and Carry, Britain could come here, pay cash, so we didn't have to loan them any money, and then take those supplies home on their own ships. We also had the Destroyers for Bases program. We gave 50 or so decommissioned, which means they're going to be blown up anyways, destroyers or warships to the British, and in exchange they gave us 7 or 8 different bases in the Western Hemisphere. Again, this is the Monroe Doctrine, even in this time of crisis. They can fight over there in Europe, and we will control more area in the Western Hemisphere. This all culminates in the Lend-Lease Act, where the Americans are now loaning money and loaning supplies to the British with really no expectation that it's going to come back, as well as we're using our own warships to protect the cargo about 2/3 of the way across the ocean, again, putting our soldiers and Americans in harm's way. We begin to transition from a peacetime economy, making consumer products, to a wartime economy. We call ourselves the arsenal of democracy. Let's let them fight over there so we don't have to use our sons to go and fight. So we're going to supply the Allies, and we're going to prepare for a potential war. In fact, this is the first time we see a peacetime conscription or draft law being put in place. There is some effort against this by isolationists, most notably Charles Lindbergh is a celebrity fighting against this, and there's an organization called America First, which obviously wants to put America first, and they feel like the Nazis aren't too much of a problem. We'll be able to negotiate. We can stay behind Fortress America, but that's really, as time goes on, that becomes less and less likely. By 1941, the United States was in an undeclared war with Germany and the Axis powers. We know this because of the cash and carry destroyers for bases, Lend-Lease style programs where we had moved from neutrality isolationism to more intervention. More obviously was that prior to joining any of the war, Franklin Roosevelt met with Winston Churchill and other leaders in the Atlantic on a ship and signed something called the Atlantic Charter. In this Atlantic Charter, we agreed to oppose Nazi Germany and the Axis powers. We even described in the Atlantic Charter how we would do so, that we would support the removal of Germany prior to any sort of attack on Japan. The United States was using warships to protect the supplies being sent across the ocean using Lend-Lease. We were supporting France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. We even lost ships because of this Lend-Lease protection, most notably the Reuben James, to German submarine attacks. So now Americans are being killed by Germans. So by 1941, we were in a state of undeclared war with Germany, and everybody knew it, including Hitler, which really impacted his policies and plans. The United States had been going through a process of isolation to intervention leading into World War II. And after everything, the event that really got the United States involved in World War II and totally removed any sort of isolationist strain in the United States was the invasion at Pearl Harbor. This was a Japanese attack, a surprise sneak attack on an American military base in Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. A few hundred Americans died in this attack, many more were injured, and a large chunk of our Pacific Fleet was destroyed. The important part about the Pearl Harbor attacks, though, was that by eliminating the isolationist element in the United States, the United States population united behind anger towards the Axis powers, and the United States declared war the day after. Within a day or two, Germany, Japan, and Italy, all of the Axis powers, declared war on the United States. And now, after the attacks at Pearl Harbor, the United States are officially part of the war, fighting on the side of the Allied powers. The start of World War II meant that the United States needs to mobilize its economy for war. What this means is that the United States had gone into a mode of total warfare, meaning that even private businesses were expected to mobilize to produce weapons of war or things that could help the war effort. It doesn't necessarily mean guns and bombs, but things like uniforms, boots, jeeps, that kind of stuff. So private industry began converting for the war even before Pearl Harbor and the official declaration of war by the United States. Remember, the cash and carry system, the Lend-Lease Act, all of those were efforts by the government to get people to start supporting the war, especially through private businesses. Remember, the United States was going to become an arsenal for democracy. We're going to send guns, not sons. That being said, once the war started, the United States was heavily in control of the government. It essentially became a command economy. For the purposes of the war, the government controlled resources, controlled wages, fixed prices, things like ration books, and using government funds to purchase giant new factories for people like Henry Ford so that they could produce new weapons of war. All of this means that there's not only the government controlling the economy, but there's also a lot of deficit spending going on. Remember that during the Great Depression, New Deal era, about $40 billion was spent in deficit spending. But because of things like war bonds and just borrowing in general, during World War II, the government is going to spend vastly more sums, which is one of the reasons why we helped get out of World War II. So mobilization of the economy for the war effort, very important. During World War II, the United States government used many of the contemporary, or in that case modern, advertising techniques to promote the use of war bonds. In fact, Dr. Seuss was an early propaganda artist promoting war bonds throughout the government. War bonds were essentially a loan to the government. So the government would give people a war bond, the people would buy the war bond, and the expectation that they'd be paid back later. Citizens were also asked to sacrifice by not spending as much and not buying as many items. So they were expected to do things like plant victory gardens, conserve their resources by not driving as much because the rubber and the gasoline would better be served the soldiers over on the front. But persuasion is not enough. Asking people to sacrifice was not enough. And the government did actually go through and force many of these sacrifices. Again, this is the idea of total war. Things are being sacrificed for the war. So rationing took effect. Rationing was done by giving of books. So each citizen was given a little ration books, and they got an allocation of stamps each week or month. You'd have to pay money for the product. Say you wanted to buy a pound of meat. You'd have to pay the dollar for the pound of meat, but you'd also have to pay in stamps. And if you didn't have enough stamps, you couldn't get the meat. So the government was forcing even people back home into these rationing situations, using these ration coupon books. There is a black market that develops, meaning that people were not using the ration books appropriately, or people were selling ration stamps. This was all illegal, of course, but the expectation was that the consumers would make sacrifices in the name of winning this war. During World War II, most people know that women were expected to join into the workforce, and that's true. The male workers were needed on the battlefield. However, this overstates a couple of things. First of all, women had always been part of the workforce going back to the start of industrialization. What's different about World War II is the women that were asked to join into the workforce would have traditionally been those stay-at-home mothers, wives, people that would have participated in what we call the cult of domesticity. Women and minorities are both encouraged to join the wartime economy. And they took traditionally male-dominated jobs, factory work, welding, assembly line work, that sort of thing. This is where we get Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter is the classic women's empowerment symbol from World War II. And it's true, like I said, that women were expected and encouraged to help out and pitch in. Women were also able to serve in some support positions in the military. Oftentimes they would have been secretaries in the office pools. Oftentimes they would have been nurses, even over near the battlefront, but they were definitely not serving in any soldier capacity. You can actually find examples of even more that women were asked to do during this time. One misconception that you need to be careful of: once World War II was over, women were not expected to stay within the workforce. After World War II, most women were actually sent back into those traditional homemaker roles that they had been in prior to World War II. In spite of all the wartime propaganda encouraging unity and people putting their racial and ethnic tensions aside, these tensions were still on full display during the war. Remember, this is still an era of Jim Crow in the South, and we had just gotten through the 1920s and the rise of the KKK and all of that nativist nationalist feeling. There are a number of individual liberties that are threatened during this time period, and we can see these most intensely through these racial issues. African Americans, again, because this is still the era of Jim Crow, really felt this intensely. The military is still segregated during this time. If African Americans could serve, they were serving in segregated units. They were being sent from their homes to military bases, mostly in the South. And many northern African Americans were facing Jim Crow discrimination for the first time. It's humiliating, especially if you hadn't experienced it before. Not to mention all the unofficial laws. I've talked to soldiers from the 1960s who, while in uniform, were expected to wait in the black section of the bus station. Many of these humiliations being felt by the soldiers are going to lead to the post-war efforts at the civil rights movement. Even during the war, the irony of fighting against a white supremacist Nazi regime were not lost on some of the African American soldiers. A movement known as the Double Victory Campaign emerged, wanting to fight against victory abroad while fighting against racism and achieving victory against racism here in the United States. So these experiences are going to influence much of the civil rights movement that comes later. As we mentioned before, the Bracero program also caused a number of tensions. In Los Angeles, a number of Mexican Americans were attacked in what's known as the Zoot Suit riots. American sailors would attack Mexican Americans in a few different places because they saw them as un-American and against what they were fighting for. Just like women were expected to pitch in with the wartime economy, minorities were also encouraged to step into those jobs that were left by the white soldiers going to join the battlefield. You need to remember that World War II was still right in the middle of the Jim Crow era, especially in the South. And just like during World War I, industrialization jobs helped the Great Migration, World War II also has a similar effect in that minorities are going to go into more cities looking to join the workforce. Interestingly, because segregation is still important, and during the 1920s you had sort of this nativist nationalist movement, many of the jobs that were left by the white soldiers going to join the war were still segregated positions, and the wartime jobs were often difficult to get for minority workers. A man named A. Philip Randolph actually threatened to use an African American labor union against the wartime economy, that the African American workers would go on strike and make it difficult to produce things. In fact, what he threatened was a march on Washington. And in fact, A. Philip Randolph is going to be one of the people that helps organize the March on Washington later by Martin Luther King Jr. Because of this threat of a march on Washington and the fear that the wartime economy might be harmed, Franklin Roosevelt, president, actually issued an executive order establishing a commission which would ensure that wartime jobs would be awarded equally among different minority and white populations, essentially opening up wartime jobs to African American workers. Also interesting during this time is that Mexican workers were welcomed into mainly the Southwest in what's known as the Bracera program. Some of the farm workers had been drafted into the military, and the Mexicans were encouraged to come into the United States in order to take those migrant farmer jobs that were left open. Some of them, this causes a lot of tension later on after World War II. While African Americans and the Mexicans that were invited into the country were facing discrimination, probably the most famous example of racial discrimination during the war would be Japanese internment. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, many of the Western states were afraid of a potential surprise attack. There was also a long tradition of racial discrimination. If you remember the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, and then in the 1920s, exclusion of Japanese immigration. So there's a long tradition of racial intolerance, as well as this fear that Japanese Americans would support Japan during the war, especially after Pearl Harbor. So without any evidence of wrongdoing, Japanese Americans, mostly citizens, including second, third, and fourth generation Americans, were taken from their homes. They were, by military order, executive order, Roosevelt's order, taken from their homes, forced to sell any of their property and belongings, and they were sent to what were called deportation camps, also called concentration camps. Now, these aren't the death camps of the Nazi regime, but this is a major violation of their civil rights. They were sent from their coastal and western coast homes, and they were sent to inland deserts in places like Utah and Nevada. In a famous Supreme Court case called Korematsu versus the United States, the Supreme Court actually upheld the decision of these to establish these internment camps, saying that the United States government had a legitimate concern and that during a time of war, civil liberties can be infringed upon. When looking back on the Japanese internment now, it is an embarrassment and a disgrace that this happened. But during the time of war, Americans did a number of things that violated civil liberties, especially against the Japanese Americans.